Morning, everybody. My name is Peter Applebee. I'm the Manager of Education Finance for New York State United Teachers, 600,000 strong union representing teachers, college professors, healthcare workers, municipal workers, school-related professionals, bus drivers across all of New York State. The first thing I'll say before I get to my specific comments is that I wouldn't disagree with anything Bob Lowry just told you. I think most people make the presumption that management and labor are on very different sides as to how an evaluation system should work for teachers. That's generally not been the case here in New York. We certainly have our differences, but in terms of procedures and the overall structure of the APPR system, everything he said would be consistent with the positions NYSUT has taken. The other two speakers didn't comment on this, so I'll just give a little background. The APPR system in New York State is a pretty unusual policy issue in New York. It was first enacted in its kind of quote-unquote current form in 2010. And unlike most legislation that passes the legislature and is signed by the governor, it didn't emanate from these buildings. The federal government, in a program called Race to the Top, offered states significant funds in New York State. It was over $700 million. If the states enacted certain education reforms, you could become eligible to receive these federal dollars. And in New York State, we were successful in getting the Race to the Top grant. And part of us becoming eligible for that grant was to enact a teacher evaluation system. The one we have now is a little different than what was enacted, but it's generally in the same vicinity. So that's a little bit unusual. This is not something that bubbled up from the public, irrespective of where they fall in the political spectrum, to say, hey, you know, our teachers aren't being properly evaluated. We should do something about this. That's typically how laws happen, right? In this case, the federal government said, here's a bucket of money. Do this, please. And New York and lots of states, we're not the only one, pursued that. So that's an unusual background. We've done 3 rounds of this in 2010, 2012, and then, as you've heard people talk in the most recent budget, significant revisions to the system once again. I handed out a document. The first page is probably most helpful for your conversations, and that is a discussion of overall principles of what an evaluation system should be. Try to summarize what that page says. This is true for any evaluation system, whether you're a student being evaluated by a teacher, that's how you get your scores, right? An employee being evaluated by their employer, taking your driver's test, take your pick, right? Whatever it happens to be. Any sort of evaluation system should be valid, meaning it measures the right things. It's reliable, meaning that if people do similar things, they get similar scores. It's accurate, it's repeatable, and it's transparent, which means people can understand it. Most of our system, especially as it relates to the state growth model, don't meet those basic benchmarks of an evaluation system. You heard Bob Lowry mention about how kind of random it is for those teachers who teach in a tested subject. The state-generated growth score is not reliable. We're not sure that it's valid, although we're pretty sure it's not valid. Teachers don't get feedback on why their students performed the way they did, be it good or bad. They don't get the questions from the test back to the teachers and see how their students performed so that they can then improve practice. Because theoretically, a teacher evaluation system should be about getting better student performance by better teaching practice, right? So if you're a coach and you try to get your players to play better, the goal is players playing better, students performing better. But if you can't get feedback as to why you did good or bad, it's a black box. So you can't get feedback. The other thing is, because it's a black box, people are inherently suspicious of what numbers generated for them. Because you just have the state government telling you, well, this year you're developing. Well, last year I was highly effective. What was the difference? Your score was lower. Why? Can't tell you. No one's going to have any sort of confidence in that type of a system. The bigger problem with the state growth model is that the number of students that most teachers teach is simply too small to produce a valid score. That what you need for a valid score in terms of what they call an N count has to be much higher in order to produce a valid score. So you see this in polling data. I'll use that as the example. When you have polling data in a statewide poll, you might see pollsters from Siena or Marist College, which are two of the larger pollers in the state, might sample 400, 500, 600 registered voters to get a reaction to policy issues or views on candidates. And there's always a margin of error associated with that, because you're not sampling everybody, right? You don't have 100% of everybody, you have a percentage. But the smaller number of people you sample, the larger your margin of error, right? So if I look at the group here and I want to know who likes vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream more, if I pick 2 people and ask them, I'm not going to get as valid of a sample as if I pick 6 or 7, right? It's more reliable. So most teachers only have between 20 and 25 what they call valid scores to determine from year to year how you're doing on student growth. And that results in a margin of error that is so huge, it's like saying, well, I'm 5 feet tall, but I might be 6 feet tall, or I might be 4 feet tall. The margin of error is so large as to render it meaningless. That combined with not knowing how the scores are produced and not knowing how I can improve myself results in a system that doesn't meet the threshold that I laid out when I first started speaking. That's all the formal comments I have. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Go ahead.
My name is Karenza Hughes. I am from Schenectady High School. And what constitutes a valid score? Like, I know many teachers, especially in a high school level, have many students. I know in our classes in Schenectady, we have, each teacher has at least 100. And how does 100 students go to 20 valid scores?
Right, so what I was speaking to, the student growth model generally applies to grades 3 through 8 currently. And the high school model is different. They don't live under the same growth model that grade 3 through 8 teachers teaching math and English do. Typically, those teachers will have just a single section of kids between 20 and 25 students. That's what I was speaking to. But you will have a situation where you may have, because you have to have valid scores, you need to have been in the school system, taken the test a prior year. The state and the district needs to know that. And in many urban areas, you have such high mobility rates that what would seemingly be a large number of students actually gets reduced to a much smaller number of what they call valid scores. We have a pre-test from the prior year, and then you give the test when you're teaching the student in the following April.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I'm Rebecca Bruce from Oppenheimer Freitas St. Johnsville. You're talking about these valid scores, assuming that each kid is coming to school every day, paying attention in class, not out skipping class. How would you take these valid scores of the kids who never come to school, once a week or so, and use them towards the teacher's evaluation when it's not their problem that the kid is not coming to school on a regular basis?
Right, you can't educate someone who's not there.
Yes. So
Right.
how can you use their scores they take at the end of the year to evaluate a teacher?
There, if I'm recalling correctly, there, under the current, soon-to-be former system, there are adjustments for long-term absences. I know that the Buffalo City School District was successful in getting adjustments to long-term absences, so the scores were weighted lower the more time you were absent. So if you were absent, say, more than 10 or 15 days, the value of that score as it related to that teacher was reduced in value because you only had the student for a portion of the time of the year.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was just wondering how, like in your overall principles, it says that you take into account the conditions of teaching and learning in the teacher's district.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how do you go about that with higher need students, students that learn in different ways? Teachers teach a specific way, hoping that they can try to reach to all students. But how do they go about that when every student learns differently? Is there a way you can try to change the testing for each individual student based on, the way that they learn? Is there a way the test can adapt to the students themselves?
So actually, there should be, to the extent the teacher can, undertake differentiated instruction to individualize the instruction as best they can to the individual student, because you have folks, obviously, in any school building, be it a high poverty building or a very high performing building, you have students who are all over the place, on the academic map. And so you should have a system that allows you, the teacher should have a system to allow them to differentiate the instruction. One of the things to deal with the wide variety of conditions in a school building is to have multiple measures. And that's why an over-reliance on a single state exam, even if it was done right, and this one is not done right, probably wouldn't be appropriate because it doesn't account for all those circumstances. And that's why in the original system, 60% of the teacher's score was connected to classroom observation and locally negotiated measures between the school district and the teacher to evaluate the teacher, because there was not a desire to have, we should back up for a second here. The federal government is part of Race to the Top, and as part of federal oversight of states, require states to have a teacher evaluation system and to use a state assessment in that evaluation system. So that's kind of the starting point for all of this. Again, this was not something generated in state capitals. The federal government required it. The No Child Left Behind Act, which is the governing statute for the federal government for K-12 schools, expired a number of years ago. And what's been happening for the last 4 years, states have been operating under a No Child Left Behind waiver. In order to get that waiver, which was important to get because under the old system, every school would be deemed failing and a lot of bad things would happen. You had to agree to have these sorts of a teacher evaluation system and use a state assessment. So we recognize state assessment has to be used somewhere. It should be minimized in its use. And secondly, the way our growth model works, it's a bell curve. And so it determines, you mentioned earlier on to the first speaker, that you see where you are at the beginning of the year, determine the amount of growth you had during the year, and you can measure that with, it's not a perfect mathematical, this is not 2 + 2 is 4. Education is a little bit of a looser concept of how the human brain works. It's not a computer, right? It's not software on a hardware system. It's not how our brains work. But you can measure that. And the way our system works is it compares the growth of the students in my classroom to the growth in students in all similar types of classrooms, and then ranks you essentially. So there's a well-known circumstance now on Long Island in a high wealth district named Locust Valley, where a teacher had all of her students, she's an elementary school teacher if I recall correctly, all of her students were proficient on the state exams, but she was listed as developing because the growth her students showed wasn't as big a growth as other teachers with students in like classrooms. So you have too small of a number, so it tends to be unstable, gives you kind of a random number generator. And then because you're being compared against people, every time an educator succeeds under that model, another educator has to fail because it's a bell curve. So 3 are gonna get A's, 6 are gonna get B's, 6 are gonna get C's, 3 are gonna get D's. Even if you get a 95 on the test, if these folks got between 95 and 100, you're getting a D. That's essentially how our growth model works now. And one of the major complaints about it is no matter how well you perform, it's relative to how other folks perform, and there's built-in failure into the model.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Kate from Oppenheim-Ephrata, St. Johnsville. So even in small schools, like in my school, I remember 2 teachers would teach the same exact subject, but one would be a classroom full of the students that are a little bit slower but are still on the regular track. And because we were so small, the classroom that moved a little bit faster wasn't considered honors, so it would be the same, the teachers would be teaching the same exact thing, but there would be 2 different performance levels. What do you feel would be the best way to evaluate those teachers, since they're teaching the same subject but would obviously have a different evaluation at the end of the year? What do you feel would be the best way to evaluate them because they are in the same subject?
Outside of the tested subjects, we have what are called student learning objectives. SLO is the shorthand, SLO, which is a bad acronym. But the SLO process has been pretty successful in most cases, where a pretest is given at the beginning of the year. This is a locally developed assessment to determine capacity and competence of the student. And then the teacher says, okay, you're at this point, and by the end of the year, I believe you have to be at that point. and something the principal signs off on, so it's not something the teachers can kind of game on themselves to make it easy. It needs to be a legitimate amount of growth, and which goes back to the individualized instruction question from before. That allows you to then individualize how a student should perform, and it's difficult to do that on a state assessment. The nature of whether it's a Scantron or even an essay type question, there's limitations to a system that's applied to 700 districts across the state. You don't get that individualized sort of touch around where a student is and then where they're going. So the SLO process has worked pretty well in most cases. I think probably the biggest complaint about the system, not just from the teachers, but generally from educators, and you heard Bob Lowry talk about this from the superintendent's perspective, is the state growth model and the reliance on it, and what was done in this last budget, a lot of people believe will cause a greater reliance on that growth model that people don't have confidence in, which is why, along with AQE, New York State United Teachers called for an opt-out, encourage parents to opt out of the exams this spring, because we feel the tests are being inappropriately used to evaluate teachers.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Bianca?
Right, like you said, teachers don't get the feedback back from the test or the answers, which lead to kids not learning from their mistakes. Is there any way that like schools or teachers could like ask for the test back after they're graded so people learn?
Yeah, the contract between the producer of the test, which is a company called Pearson, which is a private company that produced the test. Well, we call them state tests. They're actually not made across the street here at the education department. They're made by Pearson. It relates to the contract they have with the private vendor. Teachers actually who grade the tests are required to sign what we call a gag order, and those teachers are not allowed to speak or to speak about any of the test questions or answers that they see when they're correcting exams. So there is kind of a blanket on this that even if these were great tests, and all indications are that they're not particularly well done, these are public schools. You can't be a black box and say, don't worry, trust us. This is going to work out for you. If you get fired, you deserved it. I mean, that's not an acceptable outcome in our world.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Applebee.
Sure, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.